Hello, Alice. It's nice to see you. I hope your family's well.
Yes, thank you. And I hope yours as
Thank
well.
you very much. Yes.
I want to talk about your scholarship in piracy. I think it's incredibly fascinating. And I want to get back to that so we can talk in detail about it. But first, because it's Women's History Month, I just want to touch base with you more about your teaching, specifically about world history of women, and what you have learned about world history of women that you'd like to share.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I've been teaching Women in World History as a course that I actually put together for the Queensborough History Department in 2000. And at the time, there was a Women in America course, but there wasn't a Women in World History course, and I thought this would be a good complement. And over the years, of course, I've learned a lot because it gave me an opportunity to do a lot of reading about women in world history that I'd always kind of wanted to do, but never really had an opportunity to do. I had a lot of colleagues that I knew from graduate school or from the wider profession who were working on women's issues. And this was my chance to kind of sink my teeth in a little bit more. What I've been most interested in over the years has been the way that some of the student interests have changed.
Mm-hmm.
Some of that has reflected also the fact that right now, we don't have an Americanist teaching women in America. So since America's part of the world too, I let them, add that to the course. And what I found is that at the very beginning of the time that I worked on this course, students were not necessarily as sensitive to economic issues. But by the time, I guess by maybe the 2010s, I started to see many more students who were interested in slave narratives, many more students who were interested in economic issues. Their interests had shifted, and the kinds of projects that they might be interested in doing had shifted. There's a lot more interest now in autobiographical narratives than there is in literature, whereas when I first started working on the course, there were more students who would choose literature projects.
Huh.
So I've been sort of interested in the way that that some of the women and men who are coming to the courses, and it's not just all women who take it, have sort of reflected changing perceptions of some feminist issues.
So I'd like to hear a little bit more about the men in these courses. What do you think is the inspiration for them to take these courses? And it's a mystery.
Women are 50% of the population. Why should they be interested? But actually, when I think about some of the young men who've taken these courses over the years, one young man was very interested in doing work with an NGO and ultimately wound up working for an NGO. I forget which one. It's on the tip of my tongue because I'm sometimes in touch with him. He was very interested in sort of third world women issues. There was one young man who really wanted to work on Audre Lorde. Because Audre Lorde was his sister's favorite poet, and he wanted to know more about her. And there was another young man I remember who worked on Margaret Sanger. And I remember he was reading her autobiography, and he came back to me and he said, "Professor Tai, Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist." And I said, "That's right." It's amazing the little surprises you find when you start reading these sources. So, and I think that's also been sort of an interesting opportunity for me, that I have very idiosyncratic scholarly interests. I enjoy playing devil's advocate in the classroom and saying, all right, so you've said this thing about, how you feel that women are oppressed and so on. And it doesn't necessarily mean you're wrong. But let's look at this other issue. Have you considered the class aspects of this? Have you considered the racial aspects of this? What scholars now call intersectionality wasn't necessarily on everyone's radar when I first began teaching the course. So when I'd raise those kinds of issues, some students would be sensitive to them and others would not. And it's sort of been an interesting opportunity to kind of widen people's perspectives. And there are just the wonderful moments. I'll never forget one young lady we were talking about Aristotle's philosophy, and she said, "What a jerk." That was one of the great moments of my teaching career, was hearing somebody denounce Aristotle as a jerk.
You have such a broad scholarship: world history, religion, Islamic religion, and piracy. And I just wondered, because you also mentioned to me that your study in comparative slavery might be a good entry point. And I guess you were referring to women's, world history of women, or history of women.
Oh, okay, sure. Well, some of the stuff that I started doing in comparative slavery came out of the fact that my husband and I started going back to Jamaica, which is where he's originally from. I guess beginning about 2005, we wanted to introduce our daughters to where their father had grown up. But I'm not really a beach person, so I made a deal with my husband that I'd get 2 or 3 days in the archives every time we went down there. And I had been working, I'm always working on piracy, pirates are us.
Yeah.
But when I went to the Jamaican archives, I really didn't want to work on piracy. It's like, can I do something different? So what I was looking at were the slave court records, which are a set of records that aren't completely replicated. Some of the stuff that's in Jamaica, in the Jamaican archives, is also in the British archives because it was a British colony. But some things are unique to what you find in the Jamaican archives. And one such set of records are the slave court records, because these were courts that were established sort of in response to the pressure being put on slave owners in the West Indies for abolition. And they said, okay, so we're going to give slaves who are accused of various kinds of infractions due process, except that it wasn't really due process, because all of the folks who were judging these slaves were slave owners themselves. And so you go through some of these court cases and you see various slaves accused of being an incorrigible runaway and stealing and some other things. But what's really, really interesting is that when a slave did something that was considered to be such an infraction that the slave owner either wanted them to be executed or wanted them away, transported, and some of them were transported to Australia and some of them were transported to Nova Scotia. The slave owner got compensation for the slave who had been taken away from them. And I was very interested in that, because when I work on piracy, my chief interest is actually the legal case that would unfold after an incident of piracy, because the person who had been robbed by the pirate was trying to get some value back for what had been taken away from them. They were trying to get restitution, essentially. Mm-hmm. And might go to the government that they viewed as being responsible for the ship captain who had intercepted their ship. And they might sometimes go to the government of the seacoast where it had taken place, and they try and get this money back. And these cases were long and protracted and extremely interesting, because sometimes in order to try and get your stuff back, you kind of falsified what had actually happened. You perhaps tried to disguise the fact that you had been doing some trading under the table with people you weren't supposed to be trading with, and the captain who had intercepted you had actually been sort of catching you do that and saying, no, I'm confiscating all this because you shouldn't have been trading in it to begin with, and so on. It's very kind of interesting to see how these cases unfold. So I was immediately struck by that transfer of wealth in response to a slave being removed,
right?
Because it was compensation to the slave owner. And what really sort of struck me as very interesting was when, I guess it was maybe about 2015, there was the release of a massive database from the British records looking at how slave owners had been compensated when emancipation was finally pushed through in Great Britain. Because what happened in Great Britain is that the slave owners were compensated. That was basically the deal. They got a massive amount of money, which was then divided among the various slave owners in the West Indies. And this was sort of a very involved kind of financial formula that was actually brought to closure in the early 2000s. And the result of this was the release of this database. So I looked at this database and I discovered, gee, the money that the slave owners were getting for these individual slaves was way more than they got when they were compensated. And the reason why this is interesting is because the debate about emancipation had already begun when these slave courts were established. And the debate about emancipation kind of gradually enlarged over the period when these slave courts flourished. In Jamaica, there was a tremendous amount of resistance to slavery. Those who were enslaved, many of them established communities. Many of them established themselves as freemen in various Jamaican towns. And so, you know, this was a real resistance that had been going on for quite some time. So some of the slave narratives that are produced in Jamaica, many of which have the support of the abolition community, are good sources to work with. One in particular, The Life of Mary Prince, is something that students have been really interested in. And many students have chosen to work with The Life of Mary Prince as their project source. And I should just explain that in Women in World History, what I ask students to do is to choose a project and spend the entire semester reading a source and talking about how it could be used to study the history of women. And then they have to choose one website relevant to their project, and they have to choose one secondary source relevant to their project and evaluate whether they agree with the secondary source. Let's say an article in JSTOR or an article in Project Muse, a scholarly article or a chapter of a book. And that's my model also for how I teach the course on the history of piracy and maritime history.
Could you go into some detail about one of these research projects?
So that's the best part, actually, is what the students have done. Some of them have just had a wonderful time sort of making a personal best. But some students have really gotten into the nitty-gritty. Last fall, when I taught the history of pirates in the sea for the first time, I had a student who actually worked with privateering letters of marque that are in the New York State Archives in Albany. So she actually did archival work and talked about her privateering letters of marque. It was really very interesting, and evaluated the impact of privateering in the American Revolution, because several of these licensed pirates helped to conduct maneuvers on behalf of the revolutionaries during the American Revolution and played some role in ultimately forcing the British to cry uncle. And for women's history, I've worked with some students who've come up with some really interesting things. One young lady years ago who looked at Natalie Davis's biography of Glickle of Hamelin, and the autobiography of Glickle of Hamelin, and made a really cogent argument that Natalie Davis was incorrect in imagining that that Glickle of Hamelin really didn't know how to read Hebrew. This young lady showed that she actually did, and sort of demonstrated it from the text. Another young lady who was interested in incantation bowls from late antiquity in the ancient world, linked them to certain customs in her native Poland, and talked about the way in which the traditions about Lilith and some of the Near Eastern goddesses had gradually made their way into the folklore of Eastern Europe. And there was, I'm trying to think, there was another student who looked at Electra, I think, yes, Euripides' Electra, also kind of challenged the findings of a scholar whose work she found in an article in JSTOR. And I love those moments because, you know, what I'm trying to get students to realize is your intellectual abilities are just the same as, you know, any of these other people. Once you make yourself an expert on a topic, you're in a position to speak critically about it. So we just want to get you to that point so that you'll be able to evaluate these sources the way that anyone does.
That's a great thing to impart to your students.
Well, I've been really lucky. I've worked with some great students. We've been very, very fortunate in being able to work with such talented people. And, you know, it's just a matter of helping them reach their fullest potential.
I was reading about you that you are the co-chair of Columbia's Seminar on Women and Society.
Yes.
And you mentioned this has deep roots in CUNY. I wondered what you meant by
Yes,
that.
it does. Yes, it does. Actually, actually the entire field of women's history has deep roots in CUNY. Because some of the most important early scholarship that was done by scholars at Hunter College. Sarah Pomeroy, Joanne McNamara, Dorothy Haley. These were sort of people who established the importance of women's studies. And they were the ones who actually established the Columbia Women's Seminar back in 1974. And it's actually the longest continuously running seminar in the Columbia Seminar series. Maybe that's not true, but I've heard that anyway. And right now I'm involved with it, and it's a great privilege. And we have scholars from all kinds of disciplines. Many of them are CUNY scholars, but some of them aren't. From the social sciences, from the humanities. There's even been a few who are working on bioethics. We've had attorneys. So, we sort of encourage as much interdisciplinary approach as possible. And, and sometimes we even get people to come when I slip in somebody who's a medievalist, but we bring as many people as we can because we want to have a kind of continuously changing dialogue.
I know that we talked about piracy a lot, and I guess I know you explained what your particular angle of interest is in piracy, but going back to the beginning of what first inspired or attracted your or caught your interest?
When I was an undergraduate at Queens College, I did my senior thesis on the Bogomil heretics in the Byzantine Empire. And I always used to say, I like people who give other people a hard time.
It just sounds it sounds romantic, piracy, the Mediterranean, you picture these big ships and you picture,
They weren't that big, actually. They were very small, some of them. It's kind of frightening when you think about, a couple of times I've been on ships in the Mediterranean, and particularly at night, it's completely dark. You can't see anything. And I find myself really impressed by the courage of people who went to sea, because it could be very frightening. And during the day, particularly in the medieval period, sailors would kind of hug the coast. You had to be clever about it, because depending on the currents, if you got too close to the coast, you could wind up being wrecked on the rocks. So you had to know currents, you had to know your winds and directions, but you also wanted to sail close enough to the coast so that you could keep it there as a kind of a navigational tool, so that you could always know more or less where you were. And that was fine until it became dark, at which point you couldn't see anything at all. Mm-hmm. And it's quite humbling to think about how brave they were.
So you must have done a lot of traveling.
Oh,
so
yeah.
What are some of the most memorable experiences you've had traveling?
Oh my goodness. Well, some of the memorable experiences actually were not necessarily research related, although they were. Mm-hmm. I was able to bring into my teaching. For example, when I was in Turkey with my husband, and first we went to Hagia Sophia, which was a wonderful experience because I had been teaching this building for 25 years and I'd never been inside it. And I think I started crying. But going to so many of the mosques, particularly the mosques designed by Suleiman the Magnificent's great architect, Sinan, made me think about the Renaissance, the way that we think about the Renaissance in the Western European tradition in a completely new way, because it made me see some of the advances of the Ottoman Empire in the 15th and 16th century as certainly in the area of architecture being equivalent to anything that was going on in the Italian peninsula. And the more that I thought about that kind of parallel development, and Sinan has tremendous range. He's an engineer as well as an architect. The more I began to think about the early modern period as being something that should be imagined much more expansively as than just a development in Western Europe. That changed the way that I teach the period when I'm teaching the history of religion. And it also changed the way that I thought about the period, even within the context of a Western civilization course. Because, you know, what you want to do is you want to pull the camera back and give students as broad a perspective as possible. And it's useful to think about the way in which certain developments are being replicated in various parts of the world and not just in Western Europe. So I think that was a sort of an aha moment for me. And then, you know, there were other sort of glorious moments. I think, you know, when we were living in Italy, in order for me to do sort of the first bulk of my work as a dissertation candidate, we lived along the Ligurian coast. We climbed the Cinque Terre, which is a sort of a hiking route along the Italian Riviera. And that was also a remarkable experience. You know, it's physically extremely beautiful, but it also gives you a sense of what kind of geography promotes small fishing boats and you know, the kind of episodic theft that piracy really is. You know, sometimes it's a crime of strategic interruption, but sometimes it's a crime of opportunity, and you could sort of see how that would evolve living along that coastline.
Do you have one or two iconic women figures that you admire above the rest?
There are so many. I mean, I think Murasaki Shikabu, the author of the Tales of Genji, has to be a top candidate. I'm always sort of delighted to be able to say to students, this is the first novel in the world tradition, and it was written by a woman. So that's always very satisfying, and she herself seems like such a terribly impressive woman. So I guess she'd be one. I think you know, being somebody who cut my teeth on the Tudors and the Stuarts when I was an undergraduate at Queen's College with Stuart Prawl, I would have to say Elizabeth of England is definitely up there. Her political strategy. And I think, you know, there's always been a sort of a historical debate about, was she really all that? And I worked with somebody in grad school who had dedicated much of his career to arguing that the answer to that was no. But particularly as there has been more and more scrutiny of her speeches, the fact that she wrote all her own speeches and she revised her own speeches, and that she thought about how to say certain things in Parliament, that's something that I have enormous respect for. And I think over the years, I've gained even more respect for that as, you know, various political events have unfolded in both, you know, at the national and the state and local level. You start to have tremendous respect for individuals who can present themselves in a strategic way long before any of us talked about optics or any of that stuff.
Do you have other family members in education?
My father was an academic. My father was a mathematician and taught at City College for many years.
Oh.
Yeah. So I mean, I wasn't a first generation college student. I think that's, you know, but at the same time, I like to think that I've done the best I can for our students, even without necessarily having that specific corridor of experience.
Yeah.
I certainly take helping our students become their best selves very seriously.
Yes. Now, I know you published a book recently, Pirates on the Coast.
No, that wasn't a book, actually. That was an article.
Oh, that was an article.
That was a book chapter. No. That was a book chapter. It's one of several that I've done on Mediterranean piracy. A few years ago, you know, pirates have to be part of a band, right? So I fell in with a pirate band, a group of European scholars who had all read my dissertation and were interested in working with me as someone who could supply a certain amount of guidance about some of the general phenomenon of piracy that they were seeing as scholars a little bit more focused on piracy in the northern seas, the Baltic Sea, for example. Several of them work on Hanseatic League cities. Some of them work on piracy in England and France during the 100 Years' War. And I think that some of the problems that you run into talking about piracy in the northern seas are a little bit different because of the geography and because some of the distinctions in terms of the political situation, but many are the same. And this was an opportunity to exchange all kinds of ideas, and all kinds of synergistic work came out of it. Actually, I'm still in touch with some of those scholars and hoping to join them for some kind of possibly a Zoom meeting in the fall. We'd love to get together in person, but I suspect I'm going to be Zooming on the computer.
This has just been a wonderful conversation with you, Emily. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to talk with us. I've learned many fascinating things about your background and your research and your travel.
Thank you so much for having me.